So good evening. This is Matt Meyer, Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association, on the opening evening of our 28th biennial conference. It's a particularly great honor as someone who spent my life dedicated to studying and working in solidarity with the people of Africa and Pan-Africanism to have this very special panel with people from literally every corner of the continent, from North Africa and Western Sahara to South Africa, from West Africa, Sierra Leone, to East Africa, Malawi, to the center of the continent and the struggle of Ambazonia and the Cameroons, and to have moderated by esteemed and dear colleagues and friends, including one from the diaspora. So I bring greetings and introduction from IPRA because in this particular African context, and this African conference taking place in person for some in Kenya, but internationally in every corner of the world for others, because COVID-19 has given us the space and pushed us to take the opportunity of using these uncertain but possible technologies to reach out even when we can't touch each other person to person, and to have a virtual conference. And so to be able to look at Africa and Africa in global context is a special Pan-African ideal that this panel hopes to deal with today. I won't say too much except to say that very shortly, almost immediately after I was elected Secretary General 2 years ago, I was able to travel to Nigeria for a series of book launches and releases. And in that context, I made the proclamation that Africa was not just the cradle of all civilization for all time and for human history, but that Africa was also the cradle of the 21st century peace studies, a vibrant and dynamic and new way of looking at peace and justice in the world that had to understand the roots of the multiplicity of issues dealing with us and the roots of the possibilities of full human liberation. So with that in mind, it's really an honor to introduce the two moderators and to look at the struggles of Africa post-independence, post-conflict, and for the peoples of Ambazonia and Western Sahara still dealing with direct colonial experiences. So I'm excited to sit back in a moment and listen as we have these four struggles spotlighted, and we have incredible moderators taking us through. So I'll just say it's a great pleasure to have my dear friends, Dr. Hakim Mohandas Amani Williams. Hakim is a native of Lawrenceville, Trinidad and Tobago. He's Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Pennsylvania's Gettysburg College, and he currently serves as the college's Director of Peace and Justice Studies. Hakim has served as a visiting scholar at Columbia University's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity Earth Institute. Co-moderating with Hakim is Her Honorable Magdalene Moonsamy. Maggie's the founder and current director of the South African Women's Justice Foundation, and she recently was elected Deputy Chairperson of the African Union's Africa Peer Review Mechanism. Maggie served as a South African Member of Parliament following her leadership of the African National Congress Youth League. But Maggie and Hakim, more than anything, in addition to also being dear friends, are the kinds of people that, like many of us, strive to do, merge activism and academy, the intellectual and research pursuits with the taking of that research to change the world for the better. Hakim and Maggie, I couldn't be more excited to hear from you and have you co-moderating this panel. Welcome.
Thank you for having us and for bringing the panel together. Yes, this was meant to be, this conference was meant to be in Kenya. So we would have been enjoying the streets of Kenya, and it's disappointing that we can't be together. It is really, I think, a great honor and a great privilege that we have the opportunity to sit down with the same panel and to have the discussions that we needed to have in order to find the solutions that IPRA needs to find in respect of its objectives and its goals. My responsibility is to first extend my condolences and my greetings to everybody who has lost a loved one, but also to those who are still here. And I think during this time, more than ever, this topic becomes extremely fundamental. It becomes fundamental because if we have to dig deep in terms of not just the ideals of Pan-Africanism, but the indigenous knowledge systems of the African people, we would be able to find a way of protecting ourselves and insulating ourselves from COVID-19. It's quite a disappointment for me, because there seems to have been, from the Pan-Africanist intelligentsia, either a capture or a silencing, whichever, a capture and then the silencing by a neo-colonialist imperative. What we have been able to understand as a people is that once again, our mandate and our instructions come from the West. The issues of a vaccine, for example. What is the African Union saying in respect of the vaccine? What are methods? South Africa has got one of the highest indigenous plants meant for natural medical purposes in the world. And yet we are expected to extend pharmaceuticals, as opposed to saying that we can then formalize a natural health remedy. So I think one of the conversations that this topic opens for South Africa, but also the solidarity around decolonization. And I think the issue of colonization that is part of the idealistic plan of the West in respect of capturing the continent is unfortunate, because neo-colonization then becomes the stepping stone from colonialism. And what are we meant to understand as Pan-Africanists? It is to have an African pride, to reestablish African pride, African determination, the financial, mineral resources, the basic ability to be independent as a continent, but also to be independent as states, and to be united at the level of the fact that we still have an unliberated and a colonized Western Sahara. We still have a situation in Ambazonia. We have so many conflicts that are in Delgado, in North Mozambique at the moment, with rebels. The importation of terrorist activity has therefore been an opportunity to re-energize the scramble for the continent, what it is historically called. And how do we understand? I had a discussion just the other day with another member of the NGC of the APRM in South Africa. And we spoke about the implications of the Freedom Charter of South Africa, the 1955 document, that may have compromised the understanding of Black consciousness and the Pan-Africanist movement in South Africa, because it gave then the leverage of the occupiers and those who unfortunately colonized and exploited and devastated not just our people, but our economy and our political future to be equal. And the question has to be, if we understand the challenges of Pan-Africanism, as Africans, the exercise of Ubuntu is really one that says, when you come into my home, I embrace you. But how do we draw the line of the exploitation? So we love you, you've colonized us, we are one human race, but please, when it's time for you to go and leave us to our resources, to our capabilities, to our intelligentsia, to our ambitions. What is it that we want? We want to have a political reunification of the continent. Because the consequences, and I'm going to, how many minutes do I have, Matt? The consequences thank you so much, Hakim, sorry. The consequences of South Africa cheering the AU at a time of COVID and having not been able to exercise its voice for the continent and for the continent at the level of the United Nations is an atrocity by its very nature. Because it had the opportunity to reunify Africa. It had the opportunity to then go back and look at the issues that are extended into the diaspora. Which is why we have a situation where IPRA is hosting us. And we are not saying, okay, what are our rights, responsibilities, whether we are in the diaspora or not, but towards the Pan-African agenda for Black excellence. Thank you very much, Hakim. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you, Maggie, for those wonderful, necessarily provocative opening remarks. And Matt, thank you as well for the introduction. I too am quite sad that I could not be in Kenya for this conference. I have never been to Kenya. I was avidly planning. I was looking for places to stay, planning my trip, and of course, the pandemic overtook those plans. But I hope that one day that we can all reconvene in person somewhere around the world for another IPRA conference. Of course, the title of today's panel is Contemporary Pan-African Challenges. Pan-Africa is indeed a sprawling term. Contemporary Pan-African challenges are just as sprawling. And although it is not explicitly said, we do imply an attendant consideration of Pan-African opportunities. Today we have four wonderful persons joining us for this panel. I will briefly mention their bios right now, and then each of them will spend 10 minutes each talking about the work that they're doing in their own sphere of the world. And then I will offer a few brief remarks, and then we'll open it up for a cross dialogue amongst us all. All right, so that is the agenda for today. First, we have Dr. Patrick Ayuk, who is a Southern Cameroon activist, Ambazonia, and the director of the Sam Soya Center for Democracy and Human Rights. He's also a scholar and consultant of leadership for sustainable change, social justice, and development. We're also joined today by Jande Veronica Demby, who's a Sierra Leonian graduate student activist with a degree in peace and conflict studies. Veronica serves as a governing council member of the International Peace Research Association. We're also joined by Steve Sharra, who is a Malawi educator and education policy analyst. He has taught, researched, and published on peace and social justice education, decolonizing knowledge, knowledge production, and Pan-Africanism. Steve is a founding steering committee member of the Pan-African Nonviolence and Peace-Building Network. He's also a member of the Malawi Civil Society National Reference Group for the United Nations Spotlight Initiative on Ending Violence Against Women and Girls. And of course, last but not least, we are joined by Enguiaa Mohammad, who is a Western Saharayan organizer based in the refugee camps on the Algerian-Moroccan border. Enguiaa is president of NOVA, the non-violence-oriented youth group of the Sahrawian Liberation Movement, advocating the right to referendum for all of the still colonized people. And so we will go in that order. So we will start with 10 minutes for Patrick Ayuk. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to IPRA for this very important platform. I represent the Sam Soya Center for Democracy and Human Rights, and we do a lot of humanitarian work, especially with regards to the Ambazonian War of Independence. So my presentation will be around the work that we've done, how the conflict has impacted people in different dimensions, and it is actually focused on the Cameroon's colonial conflict, and which encapsulates the Ambazonian rights to self-determination and war of independence. So because of this conflict, it is always good to have a background information of the conflict. So it originates because of incomplete decolonization process that culminated in 1961 with a federated agreement between the two Cameroons. The first one of the Cameroons, which is the French Cameroon, which had its independence in 1960, came together with the British Southern Cameroons, which used to be a former British Trust territory, that had its independence in 1961, 1 year apart after the independence of French Cameroon, and they came together in a federated agreement. And that federation over time became depleted by the French Cameroon majority, the dominant population. And it was following the agreement, this federation was not supposed to deplete or change in whatsoever form, because these are two countries, two former trust territory coming together with equal powers and equal status. So it has taken this, the relegation or the depletion of the federal agreement took place through so many mechanisms orchestrated by the French Cameroon. So it was like with marginalization and ruthless cultural genocide, I say, which has been taking place for almost 50 years. I say ruthless cultural genocide in the sense that the education and the legal system, and of course, the economic propeller of the people of Ambazonia were ruthlessly destroyed deliberately by the French Cameroon government, so as to make them beggars and so as to make them people that cannot shape their own destiny. And because of these aspects that have existed for more than 50 years, the immediate or contemporary triggers of this conflict was when lawyers in 2016 and teachers decided to stage a peaceful protest against the atrocities and the actions of the Cameroon government. So Ambazonian lawyers and teachers, they staged a peaceful protest. Business people under the umbrella of consortium also did that and requested for a return to the federal agreement which made the two Cameroons of equal, two Cameroons of equal status. The government responded with serious, systematic, ruthless military campaign that took place, that started in 2016. There were arbitrary arrests, detentions, and under inhumane conditions. Burning and destruction of villages and livelihoods were some of the responses of the government to clamp down on peaceful protesters that are asking for the right to a return to the right to self-determination, which is an inalienable human right. The government in 2017 now openly declared war against the people of Southern Cameroons, who like to be called by their indigenous name, Ambazonia. On that declaration of war and the unleashment of military weaponry on armless civilians, the people of Ambazonia decided to resort to self-defense. And therefore, that is the beginning of the Ambazonian War of Independence. So when they resorted to self-defense, the government response was ruthless. The government became too repugnant and repressive. On the 22nd of September, which is the year that the people of Southern Cameroon decided to up the game through peaceful protestation. And that year, the United Nations General Assembly was taking place in New York. And because of this, on that peaceful protest, the government responded with helicopter gunships. The 1st of October was 2017, Ambazonians officially restored or made a declaration to restore their independence out of 1961. And that again was met by a brutal force from the Cameroon government. The government therefore followed that with not only brutalizing and executing people at home, but also hunting for activists in the diaspora like us. And that was followed with abduction of Sisiku Ayuk Tabe and some activists in Nigeria under the with the aid of the Nigerian government. And they were extradited into Cameroon, thus violating international conventions and rules of extradition. Today, they were also given, while in Cameroon, they were judged in the military tribunal and they were given 3 life sentences. I want the House to know that today, the 5th of January 2021, is a significant date for the people of Ambazonia. Their leader, Sisiku Ayuk Tabe, and 10 other members of their movement were abducted in Nigeria and given life sentence on January. They were abducted on January 2018, the 5th of January 2018. So today, if you look on Twitter, there is a trend on justice for Naira 10. Naira 10, the 10 of these leaders were abducted in Naira 10 hotel in Nigeria, and there were 10 of them. That is why we have a trend on a hashtag justice for Naira 10 that is actually trending today to commemorate 3 years under adoption by the Cameroon regime. The consequences, what are the consequences of this war? So in terms of the consequences, it has impacted more than 4.3 million people in Southern Cameroons. Education is now ineffective. Schooling has not taken place for 4 years. There are about 70,000 refugees in Nigeria, more than 60,000 IDPs, and more than 6,000 people have died. More than 600 villages have been burned down. Hospitals and modern medical facilities have been destroyed. Livelihood and livestock have been destroyed. I want to just make a few highlights of the level of military brutality and crimes against humanity that has been committed by the Cameroon regime. There has been a series of massacres. For instance, on the 14th of February 2020, about 24 people were killed, especially women and children, in what has been termed as the Ngabu massacre. It took place in a village called Ngabu. The military decided to clamp down and carried out extrajudicial killings, killing 24 people, including women and children. And also on the 24th of October 2020, in a school in Kumba, there is another massacre took place wherein the government militias went to the school St. Francis International Bilingual Academy in Kumba and killed 7 learners, and many of them are now carrying life-threatening injuries. So that is the level of massacre that is taking place. Extrajudicial killings are taking place, for instance, on the 22nd and the 23rd of September 2020, 10 youths were executed in Bamenda and in Boya. On the 14th of August, 2 girls were executed in Tiko when they went to hunt for snails in the nearby bushes. They were executed by the military, and 1 was brutally wounded. The invasion of a village called Nkpot in Manu Division, and that village is actually my own village, and my village has actually experienced 10 summary executions. That is my village in Nkpot in Manu Division. On this day, the 20th of December, just recently, 2020, Nkpot village was invaded by the military, and Orok Thomas and John Ojomba were executed, were pulled out from their houses and given summary execution. There has been arbitrary arrest and forced disappearance. For instance, a journalist like Samuel Wazizi disappeared, was arrested by the military, and the family only noticed that he has been killed. And up to this moment, the government is still keeping his corpse. There have been rapes and killing of clergy, missionaries. For example, Wesco and his family, an American missionary, was brutally murdered by the Cameroon military. There have been execution of priests like Cosmos from Kenya. So we notice that the conflict is not only affecting Ambazonia, it is also affecting other Africans and non-Africans that are going to Ambazonia to either help in form of humanitarian aid or to have first-hand information of what is happening on the ground, and the clergy or church people doing their humanitarian activities like praying for the people and taking care of refugees. There is rampant kidnapping for ransom taking, both from the government and some government militia that are in civil or in plain dresses, pretending to be the self-defense forces of Ambazonia. What has been the reaction from Africa and the rest of the world? The reaction from the world, most of the reaction has come from America and Europe. And as Magdalene actually mentioned in her introduction, Africa has been utterly silenced in the midst of an ongoing cultural genocide and war crimes committed in Ambazonia. Africa has been utterly silent. In June 2019, actually, the Norwegian Refugees Council actually said, the representative of the Norwegian Refugee Council said, the Ambazonian crisis is one of the most neglected displacement crises in the world. Recently, it has been described as a genocide by prominent society and political leaders. And the Deputy Executive Director of the Human Rights Watch concluded that South Africa needs to lead efforts at the UN Security Council to actually push forward for a mediated settlement or a sustainable peace in the Cameroons conflict. The United Nations Security Council that took place recently also highlighted atrocities that have taken place caused by the government and, of course, Ambazonian self-defense group, which they always termed as the separatist movements. The reaction from the USA has been commendable. On the 1st of January 2021, the U.S. Senate Committee for International Relations passed an resolution, Resolution 684, calling for a ceasefire and inclusive international mediation between the Cameroon government and the separatist forces in Ambazonia. Apart from that, and prior to that, the American government has also imposed trade sanctions on the Cameroon government, especially in relation to the AGOA trade, of which Cameroon government used to benefit. The U.S. government has scrapped that up because of human rights atrocities being committed in Ambazonia by the Cameroon government. It has also done significant aspect of withdrawing or putting a cap or reducing American aid in terms of military weaponry, especially to the northern part of Cameroon, which harbors Boko Haram. So because these equipment are being used in Ambazonia rather than fighting terrorism in the northern part of Cameroon. And to round off, the reaction from French government, a few French parliamentarians have been vocal about the war of independence. They have been vocal about the atrocities of the Cameroon government, and especially Sébastien Nodat, which is a prominent French parliamentarian. The German parliamentarians and British parliamentarians have been speaking about this war. The reaction from Switzerland has been somewhat trying to push the Switzerland human rights organization, or known as the Humanitarian Dialogue, to mediate. But what the people of Ambazonia have noticed, and other civil society groups, is that the Swiss government is working with the Cameroon government to actually delay and to confuse those who really want to bring genuine peace in this region. So that's why most of the Ambazonian civil society groups and self-defense forces do not respect and do not want to abide with the Swiss-led initiative under the Humanitarian Dialogue as an NGO. The reaction from the African countries has been utter silence, as I mentioned earlier. And of course, when President Cyril Ramaphosa came up as the chairperson of African Union with the slogan of silencing the guns, we thought, as Pan-Africanists, we thought that this slogan would be translated into real action. Unfortunately, it has failed to move from a talk shop to little or no action. So that is a very concerning situation. It is very frustrating, and it's something that academics in research for peace and development need to pay attention, especially within the Pan-Africanist perspective. To conclude, we need, as academics in justice and peace, to look at what is going on. The people in Africa are institutions that are responsible for peace, putting economic interest or economic benefit first ahead of human rights, or the rights to self-determination, or the rights to protect humanity. So we need to do a lot of work as people that are in peace studies to see how we can change the unfortunate trend that is happening in Ambazonia. So I will end here by saying that the people, we are also running a campaign for the need for a United Nations Security Council mandated fact-finding mission. As scholar of peace in Africa and the rest of the world, we need to actually see how we can help in pushing up for a peace, a United Nations mandated peace fact-finding mission in Cameroon or in Ambazonia, so as to stop atrocities and hostilities on the ground. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patrick, for sharing that important work that you're doing. I will now pass the floor to Veronica. You now have your 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Greeting from Freetown, Sierra Leone, and greeting from my side. Thank you for having me in here. Though very sad for not meeting in Kenya, I would have loved to be there as a very first time of visit. But nevertheless, it has been a phenomenon beyond our individual controls, but never mind. My topic, which I'm here to talk on, is about contemporary youth student issues in Sierra Leone post-conflict. For those who may know Sierra Leone or those who may not know, I would like to give you some brief background of it and then forge on the topic. Sierra Leone is a small West Africa country bordering the North Atlantic Ocean between Liberia southeast and Guinea northeast. Sierra Leone has a total land area of about 71,740 square kilometers, and 120 square is being covered by water, and 402 kilometers of the coastline with estimated population of 7.2 million people. About this, 45% of the total population live in urban areas in major cities and towns, such as Freetown, the capital of Sierra Leone. And the capital, which is Freetown, constitutes of 2 million people, to be specific. Sierra Leone, despite its small population size, remains one of the most culturally rich countries in all Africa, with a beautiful blend of several racial and ethnic groups living peacefully together. Despite the abundance of natural resources in Sierra Leone today, Sierra Leone remains one of the poorest countries in all of Africa. That may bring in the ironic aspect of it. Sierra Leone has a literacy rate of about 50% for the entire population, within the female literacy rate hovering around 39.9%. Above age 15, living in Sierra Leone can only read and write. Of course, poor education remains a major problem in Sierra Leone and its neighboring countries like Guinea and Liberia. Sierra Leone was once known for a civil war since 1991 to 2002, with absolute poverty. But the present peaceful atmosphere in Sierra Leone has helped the country a lot in almost all sectors of its economy. However, despite the significant improvements, illiteracy, poverty, lack of employment, and hunger remain major problems in Sierra Leone today. The extremely poor educational system in Sierra Leone has absolutely led most of the Sierra Leoneans, especially women, young girls, and youth, of which the youth are constituting 1/5 of the Sierra Leone country's population. There are several issues affecting Sierra Leone youth today, especially those in the academic field. Some of them are coming from the extreme poor interior part of the country, just to seek the university requirements or academic degrees. But to a greater surprise, most of these people who came from the interior seeking for greener pasture in the future and seeking for formal education in the universities may at the end turn to be the worst in terms of their future dreams, in terms of their career, of what they intended at a younger age and of that of old age. Youth today, but the most pressing in my view is what exactly they need, the youth of Sierra Leone, as well as the students of Sierra Leone need, for me, in my view, is about sensitizing or educating the young generation, which I am among them, about our future in the country, in Africa, and the globe at large. What will we do as long as presently, as we are living in a technological world, we need to deviate our ideology from that of our aged or our ancestors, their own mentality about education. What I'm trying to bring up here is, when they say education, we have three sectors of education. We have the skilled, unskilled, and the formal education. For me, since the population is of small, but the job market in Africa, or Sierra Leone to be specific, is very static. We may not all go to the universities or colleges and at the end expect ourselves to be in offices. But if we are training to be both formal education and that of to learn some basic skills like tailoring, constructions of housing, carpentry, and the like, where formal education fails us not to go into offices, we will find ourselves in the other way around, just for us to alleviate some amount of poverty in Sierra Leone. But during the war, there was this new system of education that was brought in by the late Dr. Alhaji Ahmad Tijan Kaba, who was the then president at that time, who brought in the new academic system by calling it 6334, meaning you must spend 6 years under preliminary school, which is the primary school, 3 years in junior secondary school, and 3 years in senior secondary school. Then for those who can afford their children to go into the university, you can be affordable of spending 4 years in the colleges or universities. And because of the poverty rate in Sierra Leone, he deemed it fit that this situation or academic system can fit in the country. And prior to that, it was working smoothly. Not until after his tenure in office, the next government who came in board, who was Dr. Ernest Bai Koroma, tried to revert the system of education by saying, instead of 6334, he said, the system of education must now be 6344, meaning once you spend 6 years in the primary school, 3 years in the junior secondary school, 4 years in the senior secondary school, and then another 4 years in the university. His supporting statement towards that was, because of the academic year is very short, and therefore teachers and students are yet to accomplish the syllabus. So he added another year to the senior secondary school so that an accomplishment of the syllabus may be done, and then whether you are fortunate to go to university or not, with that basic Western Africa certificate examination result, you may be able to find yourself in many institutions wherein you can be able to sponsor yourself at the end. But prior to this also, we also made to understand in Sierra Leone that marginalization has been another key factors, as well as illiteracy, poverty, and unemployment are the major characteristics of youth, especially those in the streets. Like, for instance, I spent 5 academic years in my university. I did 2 years doing diploma and 3 years doing my degree, my bachelor's degree. At the end of it, because of my career background, which is the peace and conflict studies, and we've already gone through the conflict scenario in Sierra Leone, the mentalities of our council of elders or the stakeholders in our country, they always discourage us by saying peace and conflict is not a marketable cause, failing to realize that it's a contemporary issues we deal with, not only during conflict, but even after conflict. Peace and conflict is very fertile. But just because they don't want us going through that career to be of under institution, because sometimes we are pro-governance, especially when the governance system is very poor and against the youth factor or academic sector. So we go in and be against them. So they've pictured this area, and then what they do, they discourage us having the peace and conflict background by saying this course is not marketable. There is no job in this country for you people. We are no longer living in the country of conflict. So with this, you get a lot of graduates being discouraged at the end, having spent 4 or 5 years in a university with no job. So what they do, they start going into street ganging, arm robbery, and then the rest. Or sometimes they feel extra discouraged and go back to the interior with nothing but frustration in their minds, because their expectation is, having done their university's degrees, they will find themselves, if not in a bigger institution or offices, but at least they may get somewhere to start life. All of a sudden, such will never happen. Then even during the study tenure, you cannot believe it. Being in a university, coming from the interior part, of course, living in the city of 2,000 population is all of another story on its own. 2 million population, you have to look for recreational facilities like housings and all the rest. And then in the universities, there are little or no hostels that can accommodate students. So these are major constraints students go through during their studies in Sierra Leone. You don't have proper logistics. You don't have enough study materials, even for lecturers to come on board to lecture students. Sometimes they do call for lectures or classes. When you pay your transport, go on campuses, it's rather unfortunate you hardly see lecturers on board to teach you, not until at the end they draw questions. They expect you as a student to get answer of that particular area wherein we are not taught. So there are lots of challenges, and then even for people to find their face, sometimes government do intervene by giving subsidies, but for that subsidy to be reflected on students, it's definitely not possible, because some of these subsidies are being given to those who can afford, especially the children of the haves. And then the subsidies are meant for those who cannot afford at all. But it's rather unfortunate, because of political gains, political interference, those who are in position can deviate those who are supposed to benefit from the subsidy, and then they give to those who are not merit, who can never merit the subsidy. The youth problem is very, very potential in terms of security and all the like, because during political or electioneering process in Sierra Leone, the agent can never go in the street jubilating or fighting or involving into violence, but it's the youth that the politicians use to cause mayhem in the streets, hoping that at the end they will get their surviving. But that's not the thing. At the end, what they will do, once they find you wanting involved in violence, you've been captured and been imprisoned. While these politicians and their children will be outside the country living luxurious lives, and then you being a mere person coming from a very extreme poverty home or poor home, you find yourself in a prison. So there are lots of challenges in the area of students and among the youth in Sierra Leone. After the war, we have gotten 3 democratic presidents elected. The first one started it. Yes, there are policies for youth and also policies for students, but most of these policies are only here and view on the social media or in the televisions and on the newspapers, and not practically done. For instance, if you are, like for me, I'm presently seeking for a job. If I go just to start as a volunteer, they will tell me that there is no space in our office. So there, the frustration starts right from there. I am not saying pay me or give me a job. I just want to gain more experience so that what I've learned in the university can be practicalized in our institution. But they discourage me right there, saying no vacancy. Even if you go for internship and intern going there, among 10 or 15 offices, maybe only one, and that will be in the private sector and not in the government sector. We encourage you to do internship program with them. And then with that, they will just ask you, we only encourage you for 3 months. After that, no job, no space. So you go in the streets with different mind, different connotations, saying what was the essence of me going to the university, spending 5 years. So at the end, for the girls, they end being in the streets prostituting. Whilst for the boys, either they go join the gangs group or they find other means of just to get their daily bread, they might involve themselves into causing mayhem. But even with that, it's still yet to be assertive that the youth are being employed, because if you don't give me job, if you don't give me food, how do you expect me to survive? I'm a young person coming up and expecting being gone through the academic system. My family may be relying on me in return to take care of them. But if there is no job, there is no means of me to get my greener pasture, how would I take care of my family? So the more I sleep, the more I see, the more I think of negative things instead of thinking of positive, because of how the higher status or the top management is treating with the bottom people, or we should I say the bottom top approach or the carrot stick like approach.
Yeah, thank you so much for the important work you're doing, Veronica. Steve, Sharra, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I began talking before unmuting myself. I hope you can hear me. Good, thank you. Okay, so I will start by giving a bit of a continental overview in terms of aspirations. So I want to begin by talking about the importance, I think, of this moment. We are just 5 days into 2021, and it's a very perfect moment to ask a question as to where things are in terms of peace and security on the continent. So I want to talk about what has been the aspiration. You might, people I think are already aware of the Agenda 2063, which is the strategy for the African Union to bring about the Africa that we want by 2063, which have been 100 years since 1963, which was considered the nominal year for independence in most of African countries. So the blueprint for the strategy for the continent came about in 2013. That's when it was launched. And that's why they're looking at 50 years from 1963, 50 years to 2013. And then the next 50 years takes us to 2063. That's why it's called Agenda 2063. Aspiration number 4 was on peace and development. And it was called Silencing the Guns. And it came with a whole program called Silencing the Guns in Africa in 2020. The idea was to, by 2020, there should be no wars in Africa, but defining silencing the guns in a broader way, because the lack of peace and security is not just about war and guns. It's much, much bigger. It's about human security as well. So it had 9 points, this program on silencing the guns, and it runs the whole gamut from ending wars by 2020 to peace education in the curriculum as a way of inculcating a culture of peace amongst young Africans as they grow, and also having mechanisms for conflict resolution at the local level, peace and harmony at the grassroots level, and all the way up to human security and also continental security and even foreign policy. So to make it operational, the African Union has been holding high-level meetings since 2014. Every year, I think almost, they've been holding these meetings. And in 2020, they released a report measuring progress on the program to end wars. And this report was released just a few months ago by the National Security, the Institute for Security Studies. So in its report, the ISS, the Institute for Security Studies, concludes that the objective hasn't been achieved. And going by the examples we've been hearing from Patrick and also from Veronica, we haven't achieved that goal by 2020 because there are still things going on. And if I can just use an example that I find quite ironic, I think, is what happened starting in November in Ethiopia. So the African Union is headquartered in Ethiopia. And that's where most of these meetings are held every year. The presidents have a summit. And so it is the headquarters of the continent, so to speak. And Ethiopia has made very good progress in the last few years. It's one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And since 2018, when they had a new prime minister, Abiy Ahmed, things really took a turn for the better. He brought a lot of radical changes that were inconceivable a year before that. So there is a whole history to the conflict there, but you probably saw in the news that there was war there. The government was calling it law enforcement because a region, the Tigray region, was, I think, sort of violating some of the, bringing some kind of conflict. There's the conflict between the central government and the regional government there, because Ethiopia is a federated state, it's a federation. So it became global news, caused huge concern. And the biggest irony of it was that just a year earlier, Abiy Ahmed was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. A few weeks ago, one of the people who nominated him is an academician at an investor in the UK, and also he teaches also at Princeton in the United States. Ayuk, that's his name. He said, had I known that this would happen, I would not have nominated Abiy for the Nobel Peace Prize. I regret, this is the biggest mistake I've made because it was completely inconceivable that a year later things would get to that state. So many flashpoints across the continent, it's quite difficult to achieve peace and to silence the guns as the agenda. But now if I can get to the case of Malawi, where we have got our own issues, but the years 2019 and 2020 have changed a lot of things in the country. We came from a dictatorship from 1964 to 1994, when we changed the system and had multi-party politics. And since then, we've been holding regular elections and we've been changing presidents. So in 2019, we had an election, but it was an election that happened in the midst of growing uncertainty and also really things, especially governance issues, were taking a turn for the West. So a lot of corruption and many things went the wrong way. So people were looking forward to the 2019 elections to change things, but then the government at the time really wanted to stay in, and there were a lot of rumors of the extent they were going to make sure they stay in power. So the election happened and the incumbent won, but there was evidence of massive irregularities, especially things that the Electoral Commission perpetrated to let the incumbent stay in power. But the people took to the streets, as well as also going to the courts. So we had two processes going on, people demonstrating on the streets, and then the aggrieved political parties going to the courts. And there was a lengthy court process that ran for 6 months in 2019. And the ruling came in February in 2020, when the Constitutional Court said the evidence was overwhelming and the election needed to be rerun. So they nullified the election and ordered a fresh election, which took place in June 2020. And a new government came in. And so since June, we have had a new government. And the remarkable thing about all this is the way there have been institutions that have taken charge of the process. The institutions have taken charge, especially the courts. So the court system has been very effective, but people also exercise their rights on the streets. And a very important player in this was the military. Elsewhere on the continent, the military is known for killing and violating people's rights. But in Malawi, when the government wanted the military to stop the protesters and even to shoot and kill people, the military said, no, we are here to protect the people. We are here to allow the people to express themselves, to the extent that the army general was fired by the president at the time. But the new president has restored that army general. So, and I think globally, this has also been noticed. There have been, the judges have received international recognition. The Economist, the magazine, I think in the UK, called Malawi Country of the Year. And the Freedom House said when the pandemic started, all over the world, democratic rights were suppressed. People lost their democratic rights, except in one country, and that was Malawi. So we have got a moment right now when we are looking at the gains we have made, some democratic capital that we have gained with this, and I think it's really a moment for us to seize upon and maybe put on the ground measures that can now maybe bring peace and development, peace and justice for ordinary Malawians. So we have got a lot of problems, no doubt about that. We still have got very rampant poverty. Corruption is still rampant, and so there are measures being taken to control all of that. But it's still a poor country. I laughed when I heard Veronica say Sierra Leone is one of the poorest countries in Africa. We think we are the poorest country in the world, or maybe in Africa. We laugh about that, but it's a serious problem. So we are hoping we can use this moment to change that and make Malawi a more peaceful country. But going back to the assessment of where peace is on the continent, the report I was referring to earlier has made some suggestions for what needs to happen next, because some of the reasons why the agenda to silence the guns by 2020 hasn't achieved its purpose. There are a number of reasons why, but one of them is because there hasn't been, governments haven't nationalized that plan and made it part of their institutions locally, which is supposed to be one of the key things to do. It hasn't happened. And also maybe the time was too short, because we're just looking at 7 years from 2013 to 2020. But also there was no monitoring and evaluation plan to say, so each year, how do we assess what has happened? Also, there have been funding issues. The program hasn't received the funding it needed. So the ISS is calling on countries to really develop their own national action plans to make peace part of the public policy and also part of the national architecture. In Malawi, we've got the national peace architecture, which includes the national peace policy, but it hasn't been operationalized yet. And that question came up during the demonstrations of 2019, because some things got quite violent at some point, and a few people were killed in the process. Women, girls were raped by the police at some point. So we a lot of work to be done, and I think what needs to happen next is for countries to really look at this agenda, silencing the guns, and maybe create another program for the next several years. Then maybe monitor it as we go along, but also make sure it's funded. Thank you.
So at this point here, we will have the presentation by Enguiaa.
Hello, good afternoon. I wish that everyone is fine and safe. I am sorry that I couldn't join today. I will talk about the issue of Western Sahara and our organization, NOVA, Group of Non-Violence in Western Sahara. So first of all, I will talk a little bit about the history. Western Sahara, or the last colony in Africa, was occupied by Spain from 1884 until 1975. And after that is occupied by Morocco from 1975 until now. In 1991, there was a convention of ceasefire between the Kingdom of Morocco and the Polisario Front under the organization of the United Nations, which promised the Sahrawi people to organize a fair referendum so that they can choose freely their fate. But unfortunately, that didn't happen until the moment. And the Sahrawis are still waiting for the referendum and independence. The Sahrawi people has been believing in the peaceful resistance and the peaceful solution for more than 30 years. But with the neglect of the international community, especially the United Nations, of the Sahrawi issue and their sufferance, the Sahrawi people got frustrated. In the last October, there were some Sahrawi civilians protesting in the loophole. It is an illegal loophole called El Gergerat. And Morocco violated the ceasefire in 13 of November 2020 by attacking some Sahrawi civilian protesting there. They were asking for the referendum of the Sahrawi people, and that violation led to a start of an open war again between Polisario and Morocco. And of course, the Sahrawi people and their only legitimate representative, Polisario, they return to the armed struggle as a legitimate method to restore their sovereignty as recognized by all the international conventions. So that is what happened. We in NOVA, first of all, we condemn strongly Morocco because of its violation of the ceasefire, and that led to the start of the war again. We condemn it strongly. We also condemn the international community, especially the United Nations, because of their neglect of the Sahrawi issue and the failure of the United Nations to organize a fair and free referendum for the Sahrawi people. we call all the international community, and especially the United Nations to enable the Sahrawi people to choose freely their fate. And also we warn that the situation may lead to an catastrophe position of the region, which is the instability and insecurity of the region.
So my comments are really, really brief here. Pan-Africanism, a polysemous term, has waxed and waned. The decolonization movement on the African continent saw a shift in the locus of Pan-Africanist thought from involving many African Americans and Caribbean Blacks to continental Africans. The hope-filled jubilation that accompanied the achievement of independence for many African peoples would eventually buckle under the neo-colonialist weight of subsequent Cold War interventions and persistent economic dependencies. In the early 1960s, the focus of Pan-Africanist discourse of continental African federalism bore the fruits of the African Union, but a more intricately woven federalism remains elusive and is a centerpiece, of course, as Steve mentioned, of Agenda 2063. Today, the Pan-African challenges are plenteous, some of which include mass unemployment, gender inequality, rigging of electoral processes, nepotism and corruption, brain drain with the flight of tertiary educated human capital to colonial metropoles, human rights violations, many kids not receiving sustained formal education, raiding of the public coffers and the corollary transfer of wealth to overseas banks, tensions between maintaining sovereignty and autonomy versus staving off isolationism amidst an increasingly imbricated and intertwined global economy, and of course, complex religious and ethnic differences, many of which were antagonized and amplified during slavery and colonialism, and are today major contributors to ongoing conflicts. The fruition of Pan-Africanism is also bedeviled by the African adoption of the basic postulates and infrastructure of the Westphalian state. This adoption has meant the importation of Western paradigms of development, modernity, and state formation, as Maggie mentioned before. This is not to say that many formerly colonized nations haven't appropriated or customized this importation, but many impugn its deficient endogenization. It is akin to a vital organ transplant that the body rejects, leading to wider corporeal toxicity and possible collapse. Also, one cannot ignore China, which has made deeply penetrative inroads across the continent and the Caribbean. Many see the African continent as a new growth frontier and are vigorously competing for resources. Of course, as Maggie also mentioned before. I think that Pan-Africanism is further delayed by the endurance of the construct of the nation state. The rejoinder to wretched colonialism is still in large part movements for self-determination of many peoples around the world, as we have heard from Patrick, and of course we will hear from Enguiaa. Until this is played out, it is difficult but not impossible to envision and actualize an enduring supranational unity. These are, of course, not mutually exclusive. There can indeed be a dialectical, if albeit tenuous, pull and tug between the reification of the nation state and new emergent sovereignties, alongside pooled political and economic Africana capital. However, there are lingering critiques of Pan-Africanism as being narrowly essentialist, superficially obscuring diverse and potentially intractable differences. Some suggest instead pro-Africanism, which would herald and usher in an era of democratization of ethno-nationalism. For me, I do wonder if the vision of today's Pan-Africanism is an elite figment. To the Black child in the Caribbean or the United States or on the African continent wanting a better education or beset by multi-layered macrostructural violences, to her, what is the value of Pan-Africanism? Does it ring hollow in today's immensely internationalist arena? An arena that beckons a planetary solidarity in the face of rapidly deteriorating global climate change. An arena where artificial intelligence is transforming the contours of geopolitical and sociological imaginaries. Yet, another reckoning is at hand, for sure, for Pan-Africanism. And in my estimation, it is to the youth that we must turn, critically retooling their futures to reconceptualizing Pan-Africanism. Maggie, the floor is yours.
Is there anybody else who would like to say anything? Okay, thank you so much, Hakim, and thank you to all the panelists. I've enjoyed the session, especially the issue of the Ambazonian matter. We have a group in South Africa of people that are trying to advance the Ambazonian struggle. And one of the things that is very peculiar about the manner in which we approach such discussions is that we must be in a position to harmonize the topic with the ideal. And one of the things that I think is so significant about what Hakim has said in respect of the youth, which has also been my position in what about the youth, is over and above the issue of understanding the self-determination and the domination, French domination. Now, I want to raise this point simply because one of the challenges of Pan-Africanism that comes out very clearly from Sierra Leone as well as Malawi is the issue of governance. So as Pan-Africanists, as the Pan-Africanist forefathers, intelligentsia, was one of the setbacks the Ivory Coast and Libya, or were we set back prior the Ivory Coast and Libya? The other issue is, apart from governance, and I think that in our understanding of the unity of Pan-Africanism and its reversal of colonialism, imperialism, racism, etc., is creating holistic intervention around not just the gangs and the murders and the etc. I think we spoke about this with Matt in one of our previous discussions on the Western Sahara, where we said that when we are faced with 1.5 trillion US dollars of military warfare, we are busy in a paper war with the United Nations. So when we talk about the fact that so many are dying in Ambazonia, and there is a fueling of, like in Somaliland, and the crisis in Somaliland, but there is a fueling as a consequence of neo-colonialist entry. So has Pan-Africanism, I think the future of our surpassing the challenges is to find the solutions. And the quickest solution that needs to be found is intra-trade, intra-continental trade, supply and demand, because that is the first attitude of the Pan-Africanist in terms of the economy and governance. Now, Malawi, a lot of Malawi's wealth is based on their agriculture, their tea, their tobacco, etc. So their GDP is relatively safe. But the governance is a problem. Then you have the Ambazonian issue, which remains an issue of a colonization, of a lack of self-determination, domination. And Sierra Leone is just generally a highly, I don't want to insult Sierra Leone, but rebellious, rebellious part of the continent. However, in its rebellion, how do we find space for unifying gang to gang and then creating a reunification back, which is part of a reintegration to our people? Because a lot of these things are not permanent. And this is what we experienced even in the DRC, post-Civil War. That the experience of child soldiers, the experience of gangs, the experience of rebels, like there are emerging rebels in northern Mozambique, rebels emerging in the DRC, etc., etc. The experience is that ultimately, when there is an impasse and there is the possibility of a democracy, that the rebels, the gangs, the fighters want to drop that life and have an active role in the economy. So as Pan-Africanist, what is the reintegration program? But in finality, I want to raise the point about understanding and redetermining African democracy within Pan-Africanism. Even if democracy may not want to be the kind of opted for ideal or idealistically because of the Greeks, and there is a need, or there has been a transmission of democracy via the Mediterranean into Ethiopia, into Egypt, for example, the closer, the proximity. It may be by default, by its very nature, that the multiplicity of ethnic, tribal differences should be harmonized and re-emphasized under this youthfulness, bringing in these young people, but also as a means of creating a solid boundary on the African continent to readjust not just the continent, but those in the diaspora, to readjust and to reappreciate. Because I think the idea about talking about these things can sometimes make one wonder, unless, and of course, we re-engineer the attitude towards governance. So when you have a replacement of government like you do in Malawi, it's possible through the judicial system, which means that there's an active judicial system. That judicial system can then work in the favor of a Pan-Africanist Africa. So we need to find what's working and make what's working and efficient work harder from the upper echelons, from the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. So we need to make these aspects of our participation and our wanting to resolve the challenges of Pan-Africanism, the solution lies in the hands of decision makers to make Pan-Africanism a part of a daily life of African democracy. Thank you very much.